club is always near and dear to my heart. So about 15 years ago, I took my very first beekeeping course, and it was through TriCounty.
Mhm.
So it was years and years ago when it was over in
Stockton.
yeah
Prospect.
Prospect.
Mhm.
Yes, it was over in Prospect at the little community center there, and so yeah, so that started my journey of beekeeping. Was I guess it was 50, maybe it was almost 20 years ago. Ooh, time flies. So Tri-County is always near and dear to my heart, so I always love seeing this club. I'm Jen Lund, for those of you who have never met me before. I am the state apiary inspector, so normally I'm it for the whole entire state. Luckily this year we were able to hire somebody, so I have somebody who's working in southern Maine and doing a lot of the inspections down there, and it's been lovely, because usually I'm traveling from where I live north of Bangor down to York County several times a week. And so it's cut down a bit of my travel, which is very nice. And tonight we're going to talk about mites a little bit for about half the time, and then we're going to talk about kind of going forward from this point in the year. So what you should be looking for, what you should be paying attention to in your hives, and how to solve some of those problems, because we are hearing beekeepers who are struggling with their hives that they installed this year, and so how to fix those problems. And so we're going to start with kind of the overall picture of Maine. These are the loss numbers for the last couple of years. So last 2019-20, because our seasons go from April to April, it's kind of a split season. Our losses were 35, 36%, and before that it's been around 45% pretty consistently. So we had a good year that last season, a better year, I guess I should say. But we do have some counties that are really struggling, that have really high rates, and then we have others that are doing okay. So the big driver, and this was data that the beekeepers provide me, so if you've not filled out the online survey, if you just go to the Department of Ag, Maine, and put in apiary or bees, my page will come up, and right at the top there's a link to provide your data from last season, and I use that to generate these numbers. So this is beekeepers who've told me what their losses, what caused their losses, why they had losses. And so in the summer, queen loss failure, varroa mites, this was for 2019-20, winter, varroa mites, and then unknown. So I do a lot of hive autopsies. I go out and look at a lot of dead hives, and almost always it's caused by mites. So a lot of this unknown I also attribute to mites, because that's what I'm seeing when I do hive autopsies. The previous year, same thing. Varroa mites was number 2 in the summer, number 1 in the winter, and that unknown was also very high. And so I mentioned this already, my autopsies that I do with beekeepers, about 25% is queen loss, starvation, poor winter, something like that. 70% to 75% is varroa mites and viruses. That is what is driving our losses in the state. This is where most people need to start focusing, if they're not already, on their hive management is varroa mites. That's the number one thing you should be looking for. And then everything else, all those really scary things that we hear a lot about, like foul brood, American foul brood, that really bears, all of that makes up about 5% of our losses. So really the focus is varroa mites, and that's why I'm going to talk about them a bit tonight. So varroa mites, Varroa destructor, this was originally from Southeast Asia. It was on a different species of honeybees. So there's several different species of honeybees. None are native to North America, but there's one, the Asiatic honeybee, the Asian honeybee, that has had Varroa destructor on it. And our bees, the western honeybees, the ones that we manage, share the same habitat in parts of Asia, and of course it jumped from that honeybee onto ours. So ours did not co-evolve with it. It does not have any natural immunity towards varroa mites. So I'll pass out a couple of these. This is what they look like, so you can see them with your naked eye. Well, I guess it depends on how mature your eyes are. Whether you can see them. They're small, red-brown, triangular in shape, and they feed off the body fluids of adult pupal and larval bees. Primarily, they're feeding on the fat bodies. So the fat bodies on bees are found kind of all throughout the abdominal cavity, and that's where these mites are feeding. And they're one of the largest ectoparasite to host relationships. So if we made honeybees as big as we are, the mite would be this big on us. This big. It looks like the size of my head almost. So if you can imagine walking around with 1, 2, 3, 10 of these feeding off of your body fluids, that can be pretty devastating. We lose our minds for little tiny ticks. Like, we get the heebie-jeebies from them, you know, you like walk around and you like are scratching the rest of the day, like taking off your clothes randomly and looking if you find one on you. So imagine walking around with these sucking your body fluids out of you. And so they have a 2-phase life cycle. They have a dispersal phase, and that's when they're on our adult bees, and they're moving from bee to bee as the bees are coming in contact with each other. They're actually relatively fast, and so if a bee meets another bee on a flower or someplace in the hive, they'll walk across and go on to the new host. And they can move to uninfested colonies through drift. So especially if you're new, you may have read at some point that bees don't move from hive to hive, that if a bee from one hive goes into another, they'll fight to their mortal doom or mortal death, and they won't allow outside bees. Totally false. Bees are actually very social. They're a lot like us. So if a bee goes out and forages, comes back, lands on the wrong hive, and walks up to the door and says, "Hey, I got food," bees will let them right in. They want that food. It's the same at my house. You show up at my house with a pineapple cake. Be forewarned, pineapple cake is one of my favorites. My husband keeps saying I have to stop using pineapple cake, though, because he's sick of eating pineapple cakes. But if you show up at my house with a pineapple cake, I will let you in. You can have the Jason mask, a knife. Come on in. Like, you brought a knife to cut it. You got food, you're my friend. And it's the same with bees. So you can have bees from away that are visiting your hives, going into your hives, and bringing their mites with them. And the mites are feeding between the abdominal segments on the underside of the bee. So this is where the fat bodies primarily are, right here in the bee. And these are tucked in underneath. So if you are looking at your bees to see if they have mites, you're not going to see them unless you are rolling them over, tickling their bellies, looking underneath them. You're not going to be seeing the majority of the mites. Occasionally, you will see a mite on the top here. This is one that's looking for a new host. So it's already fed on this one. It's looking for a new bee to feed on. And that's about 5% of the bees that are in the dispersal phase, which is about 20% of bees are in the dispersal phase in a hive at any given time. So 5% of 20% is a very low number. So if you're seeing a lot on the back of your bees, you have a really serious problem. It's already probably too late. So they puncture the exoskeleton and they feed on the fat bodies. So fat bodies are they're a really important organ for us. It keeps us warm in the winter and snuggly for our partners. But on insects, the fat bodies have about 11 different functions. Of those, one of them is their immune response. So if a bee eats something that is pathogen, so they eat a virus or bacteria, the fat bodies will actually neutralize that. So they act like kind of our white blood cells. That's right? I don't know much about vertebrates. Vertebrates is like, if you have a spine on the inside, it's weird to me. So like white blood cells. And then the fat bodies, they also do detoxification. So they're almost like the liver of a bee. What happens is if a bee eats something toxic, the fat bodies break it down into non-toxic substances. Also, if there's a time of food scarcity, the bee can actually digest part of its fat body for backup energy supply. So that's only 3 of the functions, and those are really important ones of the 10 or 11 that fat bodies have. So it's the immune response, it's the backup energy supply, it's the detoxification. What the mite is doing is it actually takes its mouth parts, it injects saliva, so it throws up into your bee. So that digests, the enzymes in their saliva digest the fat body into the perfectly thin, lovely milkshake of fat body juice, and then slurps it back up. And so they're actually removing the detoxification, backup energy supply, the immune response of the bee in their feeding. And they can stay on an adult bee feeding for 5 to 6 months if there's no brood. So they just survive the winter feeding on our adult bees in their cluster. They also have a reproductive phase, and this is when they're in the brood. So the mites, 80% of them in your hive, if you have brood, are going to be in the brood. That's where they want to be. They want to be making babies. It's the drive of every creature. And so the female mite leaves, the adult bee goes into a cell that's about to be capped and hides in the food. Once it's capped, she starts producing eggs. Her first one is unfertilized, becomes a male. Then after that, she fertilizes the eggs and they become females. Right before that bee emerges, the mites mate, and there can be multiple mites in there, so sisters and brothers mate, happens in nature. And then they emerge out with the adult bee. And they can go on their dispersal where they go find a new bee to feed on, or they can just drop into the next cell and start reproducing right away because they've already been mated. And so the average mite will produce 1 to 2 offsprings per worker cell, or 2 to 3 per drone cell, and that's because drones take a little bit longer, so they can kind of squeak out 1 more offspring on average in those. And they prefer drone brood. As a result, they actually can have figured out that they can make more babies in drone brood, and they will preferentially select that. And so the populations increase in your hive very rapidly. It almost doubles every 20 to 30 days. So every kind of brood cycle, you're doubling the amount of mites that you have in your hive. So if you have 2 per 100, the next month you're going to have 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, and they just grow rapidly. On top of it, in the saliva that they are regurgitating into your bees are viruses. And those viruses are being injected into your bees that now no longer have an immune response because that's been sucked out of them by the mites. So we have 20 plus viruses. I think we're up to almost 30 now. And they spread all different types of ways, but most have an association with varroa mites. There's no treatment for viruses. It's really keeping your mites low. If you keep your mites low, you're unlikely to have severe virus issues. One that you may see, I can't tell you, I can tell you that you have a virus issue in most cases. If I go and see your hive, if it's struggling, I usually can't tell you what type without molecular testing, and I don't carry around that in my back pocket, so I just usually say you have a virus issue. This is one that we can tell, deformed wing virus. You can see the symptoms of this one is that the bees emerge and they have these stunted, deformed wings. You can see this one right here has a mite on it as it's emerging. 2 mites, there's one here and one here. And they can't fly, obviously, and they only live for a couple days after they emerge. So what happens is you'll often see them out in front of the hive. They come out of the cell, drop to the bottom board, walk out of the front of the hive. They can't fly, so they kind of just fall to the ground and wander around like little disease zombies out there. And so you sometimes when you go and look at your hive, before you even open it, look out in front and see what's going on. If you're seeing bees with deformed wings, you likely have a mite issue in your hive. There's other generic symptoms, and same thing, look out in front of your hive before you open it up. You want to look for things like trembling or paralysis, darkened bodies. So this here is actually a honeybee that has virus. It's like really, really dark. And so if you see a lot of these in a hive, you probably have a really severe virus problem. Same thing here. The viruses also cause the bees to kind of pull out their hair or develop without proper hair. And so they get greasy looking and they almost look like wasps. So if you're seeing a lot of these in the hive, you have a virus issue. Again, the deformed wings. And these bees just don't live as long. You know, they're sick and they probably don't have an immune system because it's been sucked out of them because of by the varroa mites. And so this is the biggest problem. They carry and spread viruses. If left unchecked, they will kill your hives. And they really are problematic certain times of the year, but this isn't only the times that they're problematic. I've seen hives that are brand new installed from packages or from nukes that have high mites. So it's really important to check and see what's going on. Just don't think that because you have a new hive that you just bought that it's mite-free, because that's not always the case. Are there any questions? Feel free to interrupt me anytime. I'll just keep talking otherwise. So feel free to interrupt anytime if you have any questions or I say something that doesn't make any sense. You want to call malarkey on me or something, that's cool too. But there's 2 times when that it becomes really problematic for most beekeepers. And that's when bee numbers are reduced in preparation for winter. So we're talking about starting in like late July. that's when we start seeing mites increase. And then also if we have poor forage during the summer. So last year was a really great example of that, where we had no food for the bees, and so the bees, if they don't have enough food coming in, they kind of just level off their population. They won't continue growing. So they'll level off, and that allows the mites to increase. So what this kind of looks like is your bees are increasing through the season, your mites are increasing, and as your populations decrease, I have a pointer, I'll use the pointer. As your bees are decreasing, your mites are continuing to increase, and you can see how this number changes very quickly from 6 mites per 100 bees when you have a high population, all the way down to 35% infestation, so 35 to 100 per 100 bees. And it's mostly to do with the population here. So this is growing exponentially, and then you have this kind of decreasing at the same rate. And so if this normally happens kind of in this July, August, and that's when we start decreasing, and that's when we start making our winter bees. So those are the bees that need to be the healthiest. But this can actually shift sooner in the year if we have bad forage. So if the bees shut down prematurely because there's no food out there because we're in severe drought again, this can happen sooner. So it's really important to be vigilant. And this is what a mite death kind of looks like. So this is the very first hive. I always show this picture. The very first hive I ever inspected in this position. I started in November, got a call about a dead out, and this was the hive that I went out, very first one. And you can see this was a small, tiny population left, and as you got closer, you can see all the mites. These are all dead mites. There was an absurd amount of mites in this hive. And so what happens is the bees, as they feel sick, because this was a large population going into the winter, as they feel sick from the viruses, their reduced immune system, maybe they're eating some toxic stuff that's not getting broken down, they go off and die someplace else. They're much kinder than we are. We actually go to work when we're sick. I do. Maybe not anymore. Maybe we've learned a lesson, right? Yeah, now we stay home, right? And so they go die someplace else. The population gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you get a hard freeze, and it can't keep warm and dies. And so just mites as far as you can see. And this is also kind of falls in the same line. So this hive, if it didn't freeze to death here, so this was the population, it all kind of froze and died here. But if this hive is failing in the fall and it's still warm out, and it's dying from mites and viruses, the queen dies, those bees will actually go and inhabit other hives. They'll just move to the next door hive or down the street or a mile and a half away, bringing their mites with them. And so your mites may be completely under control, and then just in the blink of an eye, you inherit mites from somebody else's dying hive. So it's really important. I usually like to talk to clubs about having kind of a community effort on mite control, making sure that kind of this is where you guys all communicate, and you're like, hey, I'm seeing high mites, check your hives and treat accordingly, and kind of work as a community to keep your mites low, because it's not only your problem, it's everybody else's problem if you have one. And so what you can do is monitoring. Monitor, look for the mites. You need to know what your mite population is in order to determine when a treatment is needed. And so we have been working really hard, and me, the royal we, in trying to increase monitoring, and we've been pretty successful. We started, when I first started this position, we were at 50% of people were actually monitoring for mites. We're up to 75 now, which is good, and we've been really increasing this one here, the alcohol roll. We've been pushing it a lot, just because that is the most accurate way to monitor for mites, and I'll talk about that in a second. But just to let you know, there's still 25% of people who aren't monitoring. So if you have beekeepers that you work with and they're unsure about how to do it and you know how to monitor, help them, because it also helps you. So, and a lot of people are using more than one method, which is great. I really, really like that. So it needs to be accurate. Just using your visual signals, seeing them on the backs of bees. Remember, we talked about represents 5% of 20%, so a very low number. If you're seeing this, you already have a big problem. Another popular way to monitor is pulling drone brood, and that's a great way to kind of get a good feel for what's going on, but you should not use that to make decisions or to think that you don't have a problem, because This here, this is a brood, and it's got a mite on it, so you would pull this out, and this is the right stage, the dark eye stage, that's when you're supposed to pull them out to look. This has one mite, but the mites are actually clear to white before they mature. So this here, I swear there's stuff in here. These are actually immature mites. You guys can pass that around. So you wouldn't be able to see them when you pull out that brood, because here's a mite, pointing at this arrow, and here's another mite. So you might count one when in fact you have three. And so that's a really gross undercounting. You have a really severe problem in this hive. So they're just not apparent, and it's just not a really great way to determine whether you have a problem or not. So we find that people who are monitoring have lower losses, so our no monitoring here at all. We have 59% losses, so this is the loss rate. This is the overall, everybody included. This is those people who are not monitoring. These are people who are monitoring, so they have lower loss rates than those that are not. Those that are using alcohol rolls, look at those loss rates. We're talking like 30% to 40%, which is much lower than those that are not monitoring, and even lower than the overall. And then using other monitoring methods, so using drone brood removal or sugar shakes or something like that, have higher loss rates. So they're up at the 50%. So those other things, those other methods are just not as accurate. People are losing hives because they're not accurate. So alcohol roll, if you don't have one already, grab one of these nice jars. This is my last bunch of them, so if you already have one, please don't take another one. I will be making more up, but canning jars are really hard to find right now, and they're super, super expensive. So I'm kind of trying to figure out alternatives right now to these. There's nothing really super fancy about this. You can make one yourself if you want to. It's just got a hard lid, and then it's got this screen. That's the only thing that makes it special, is this screen. And so to do a mite roll, what you want to do is find a frame of brood, open brood, and maybe some capped brood, places where there's going to be nurse bees working, because you want to focus on the nurse bees. And you're going to take your frame out, you're going to get yourself a white pan, and you can pick these up at any dollar store. These are not in short supply. Take your pan, put it on the ground, just pretend I'm on the ground, and then take your frame with your bees on it, and you don't need a ton of bees on there. We're talking 300, which it's not actually a lot. Like you can take a huge frame, and that'll be cups and cups of bees. And so you want to look really carefully, make sure your queen's not on there. If there's too many bees and you can't tell, you can shake some off into the hive and then look with less bees. Then you're going to take your frame, bang it into the bucket, and then you're going to take a half a cup measuring cup, which I don't seem to have, which is weird. Half a cup is 300 bees. Science determined that, so this is what we do, scientists do. We figure out how many bees fit into a half a cup measuring cup. And you scoop it out. You have alcohol in here. Any alcohol will do. Rubbing alcohol is fine. It doesn't seem to be in short supply anymore, so I would just say get some rubbing alcohol. If worse comes to worse, you can use cheap vodka or something like that too. Don't use the expensive stuff. It's not worth it. Unless you're making a fancy cocktail afterwards. But put your half a cup of bees in there, and then you're going to shake this up for a full minute. Then change out the hard lid for the screen lid, and then shake all the liquid into the bucket. And what you're going to be left with is all of the mites are going to go through that screen, the bees are going to stay in the jar, and then you can count how many mites you have. And your magic number is going to be 9. If you have 9 mites in 300 bees, you have to do something immediately. There's no time to waste, because your mites are getting to the point where they're really, really problematic. If you are at the 5, 6, 7, 8 range, you have 5, 6, 7 range, you have about 2 weeks to do something, but you have to do something soon. If you're lower than that, you have some time. Recheck in a month and see where you're at. So just remember it's kind of a floating target. If you are high at the beginning of the year, you will be chasing it all year if you don't do anything about it. If you're at the 3, 4, 5 at the very beginning of the season, that hive will be dead before the fall.
So we should do it now.
Oh yes, you should check your mites now, absolutely. And so it's really important to do this regularly. I always say the very first hive inspection of the year, do it and make sure that you are low, that you're starting the year off good. You want to be low. You want to be in that 0, 1, 2 range for that very first inspection. If you're not, you need to do a treatment. When you get a new hive, a package or a nuke, you can actually sample right out of there. 300 bees seems like it's a lot in a package. A package is 3 pounds. That is 10,000 bees. They're not going to miss those 300. And you know where your queen is. She's in that little cage. So you're not going to kill her. She's in that little cage. You put her in, take a scoop right out, put it in your jar, install your hive, and then do your shaking and all that afterwards, and make sure you're not starting off with a problem. I have had beekeepers report to me. So one of the clubs in southern Maine did a survey actually they do it every year now, where they get reports from the beekeepers what their mite rolls are coming out of packages. Most of the time it's low. It's in the 0, 1, 2 range. But they have gotten packages that are 19, 20, all the way up to 47 mites. So that's 47% infestation. Like, that's absurd. Or close enough. 25% infestation or something like that. But that's a lot. That hive will not survive to winter. So we did write a grant. That's where we got the funding to make these like nice little jars and hand out these things. So please, please, please sample your hives. Don't just treat. Sample your hives. Varroa mites kill hives. If you don't sample them, you don't know when to treat them. And sample your hives. It's really important. See, look, it's bold with 4 exclamation points. So that means it's really important. And there's 2 methods that we use for, or kind of in joint methods that we use for control. One is prevention. So it's strategies that we use in our hives that keep the mites lower longer. So it's doing splits in a way that you pair them with going broodless for a period of time, caging a queen, that sort of thing. Drone brood sacrifice. Remember I told you that the mites really like drone brood? That's where they reproduce the most. So if you have a frame in there that's specially made for collecting drone brood, you can put that in there, let them put drone brood in there, take it out, freeze it, feed it. I feed it to my chickens. I take them up and put them in front of my chickens and they eat them up. You can use a medium frame in a deep, and they'll usually draw down that bottom part with drone comb. You can just slice that off, put it in the freezer, and you're killing any mites that are in there. So it's really just pulling some of those mites out. It's not going to be your only control method, but it's going to help. It doesn't hurt. Screen bottom boards, there's some studies out there that you can lose 11% of your mites through a screen bottom board. Maybe. Doesn't hurt. It's another strategy. And requeening with some resistant stock. So if you have the capabilities of finding some stock out there that shows better resistance to varroa mites, take advantage of it. Genetics is a good thing. There's also intervention, so prevention and then intervention. And we call this IPM. It's integrated pest management. It's where you're using multiple tools to get to the same endpoint. And so these are going to be your miticides. So when you hit that 9 mites or that 5, 6, 7 mites and you need to do something, this is what you're going to do. You're going to do something that knocks them down right away. So we have lots of different options, not tons, but we have several, and they all work better at different points of the year. I always get the question, what is the best thing to use? Just period. What is it the best thing to use? And I always say it depends. There's a lot of differences. Some work better at certain times of year. We have Amitraz, or Apivar, Apigard, Apolifar. These are both Thymol products. These are based off the thyme plant, so it's a kind of a minty sort of thing. You don't want to use those with honey because they'll make your honey taste like Listerine. It's not poisonous, it just tastes terrible. So don't use those with honey. We have formic acid products, Mitaway Quick Strips and Formic Pro. That is one of the only products that we can use in the middle of the summer. When we have honey supers on, that's effective with brood. And because it kills mites that are underneath the capping in the brood. And we have HopGuard. This is just reformulated. I don't know how the new formulation is. This formulation wasn't great, so use that one with caution. And then we have oxalic acid, and there's a couple ways that we're using that. But again, if you have brood with oxalic acid, it doesn't work because it's a very short term. So where things like all of these other products, they work over a period of time. Formic acid is 20 days. 10 days and 10 days that it's working over. So as the bees are emerging with mites, it's killing those mites. Whereas this If you're using it as a vaporizer, it's only active for about 10 minutes in the hive, 10 to 20 minutes. Once it becomes not vapor anymore, it's right out of the system. So it's not killing those mites over time. So it doesn't matter how often you do it, you're only hitting a very small percentage, because remember, it's only the mites that are on the bees. If you have brood, most of your mites are in the brood, and so you're only hitting it for a very short period of time. But in the fall, or the early winter, when you are broodless, this is a great strategy for knocking down your mites. So, temperature, the things you have to pay attention about when you're talking about miticides is temperature. There's only certain things that you can use at certain temperatures. You don't want to be too hot or too cold for some of them. You also need to be aware of your honey supers. There are lots of things that you cannot use when you have honey supers on or you're making honey. And then the other thing is whether you have brood present or not. I forgot to put it on here. So if you have brood present, some things work better than others. So there is a nice little brochure that we made right here that goes through all the different kind of miticides in a nice little chart. And it tells you this very first column when it's the most effective. So if it's got a tree in that spot, that means it's effective at that point. And then whether you can have honey supers or not, what PPE you need. Please be careful with these things. These are pesticides, and so you have to be careful with them. And that's all I'm going to talk about for intervention. So grab one of these on the way out.
With the oxalic acid, could you explain the sugar drip on that? Because how do you mix it?
So it actually comes in a pre-mixed syringe now.
So you can't use the powder to mix it up?
I don't think so. I don't think it's it comes pre-mixed now, so I don't think it's even, is it on the label anymore? I think they took it off. I can't remember. It might be on the label. Can you pull it up for me, Jake? Oh, thank you.
It was on it.
If it's still on the label, so oxalic acid is a funny one right now because there is going to be a label change that's coming through. So it used to be that you cannot use it with honey supers. They're going to change that label, and so it's going through the process of a revision on its label. So they may actually take off the syrup dribble. I think you can use the powder as it is now. Let's see. So 5 mils each frame, 50 mils per colony. I don't remember how to mix it up. I've always just used the syringe when I've used it, so I just buy it pre-made. I'm lazy. So.
Oh, you're still waiting on it?
Yeah.
Well, hold on. You continue, I'll
Okay, all right, yeah, so you chime in when you find it. And so, prevention, intervention, we have beekeepers that are using both. So this is the percentage of beekeepers that are using these different things. So we have a lot of people who are using screen bottom boards, about 30%. Oxalic acid is by far our most commonly used miticide, and then the formic acid products are second.
Okay. You want to give me one?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so yes, it is actually on the most current label.
Most current label, okay.
Which says that you have to completely dissolve oxalic acid dihydrate in warm syrup. You're 35 grams of oxalic acid per 1 liter of 1:1 sugar syrup. And then it's 5 milliliters per seam of bee, not to exceed 50 milliliters.
Yes. So 35 grams
Per
per
of
50
oxalic
per 50
dihydrate per 1
milliliters.
liter.
Or 1
of
liter.
1:1.
Easier to buy the syringe.
Yeah.
I know, but I have so much oxalic acid, I hate to buy more, you know? I just thought sugar drip sounded
Yeah.
easy.
The sugar drip is becoming more popular in the Northeast. It wasn't as popular when it first came out. Vaporization for up here made more sense for most beekeepers because we're often, so because you couldn't use it with honey supers, you're talking early in the season, late in the season, and we're cold and cold at those 2 points. So you don't really want to dribble liquid over them. But with the way the weather has been and how it looks like it's going to continue being in the future, we're changing. And so in southern Maine, a lot more people are doing the dribble very early in the season.
Well, can you use the dribble if you take your honey boxes off and dribble under them?
Yes, as long as you're removing your supers, yeah. But again, it's another one where it doesn't work great when you have brood. So that's the other thing that you have to put into consideration because again, it's, yeah, it doesn't work great with brood, so yeah, and we still have 7% of people who aren't doing any management, so Don't let that be you're not part of the 7%, right? All you guys are gonna manage your mites. And it's important because those that treat for Varroa, we have 40% losses. Those that don't treat at all, doing anything, we're up at 80% losses. So mites kill your bees, no doubt about it. If you're not doing anything about them, they're not gonna mysteriously do it themselves. And then that prevention and intervention, if we do both of those together, we are seeing some positives there. So we're down around 37, 39%, 40% losses. So just remember, if you don't treat, your hive is probably going to die. If you're not managing in some way, your hive is probably going to die. And so I have to say this, use only labeled products for controlling pests and diseases. Off-label uses are dangerous, ineffective, and illegal. Don't make me yell at you. I don't want to yell at anybody. So please, please, please use the stuff you're supposed to be using in your hives. This is a really great resource, Tools for Varroa Management Guide by the Honeybee Health Coalition. This is a little card to remind you, so take one on the way out. It's a free online guide. It is like the Bible for Varroa mites. It goes through the biology, goes through how they grow, the different types of miticides. It hasn't been revised in 2 years. It is being revised this summer. So there should be a new version coming out, but it's totally free, totally online. You can get a black and white version or a color version, so you don't have to use your expensive color ink on it to print it out. And they take all of the science out there and condense it into a really easy to read 30-page document. So that's all I have about Varroa mites. I know, this was a really absurd break. I was working on this earlier and I was all jazzed up on extra sweet tea, and so we're gonna move topics. So I'm hearing a lot of people who are talking about a weak buildup this year. And so when we talk about hives, there's 3 things that you need to focus on to have a healthy hive. I mean, there's lots of other things to focus on, but 3 things that are the most important. It's like a stool with 3 legs. If you are missing one of these things, you cannot sit on that stool. Well, not for long, unless you defy gravity. And then if you do, that's awesome, because I kind of want to meet you and live your life of defying gravity, because that sounds amazing. The first one is Varroa mites. You need to be controlling your Varroa mites. If you don't, your hive is going to die. You want to make sure that your queen is healthy and happy and laying well and vigorous. So good queen quality is really important. And the third one is having proper amount of food in the hive, or food available to the bees. So those 3 things. So if you have a hive that is struggling, one of those 3 things is not right. And I lump Varroa mites is the most important pest and disease, but there are some other ones which we're going to talk about for a couple minutes that you should also check for. So if your hive is struggling, most likely it's a mite, a queen, mite or disease, queen, or a food issue. Not always, but more than likely. I mean, if you see a bear sitting on it, it's not one of those issues, it's a bear, but. So, first thing you want to do if you have a hive that's struggling is you want to check for pests and diseases. You want to look for your Varroa mites. We've already talked about that. We're not going to talk about them anymore. Nosema, small hive beetle, brood diseases. You want to look at all of those things and make sure you don't have a disease problem. That's going to, or a pest problem. That's going to be your number 1 first thing to look for. And so you want to look for healthy brood. Every time you open your hive, you want to at least look at 2 frames of brood. You want to pull out a frame of brood, make sure everything looks good. Pull out another one, make sure everything looks good. You don't have to see your queen every time. It's not important. If you see good brood, healthy, uniform in appearance, nice big fat white larvae, pearly white, they don't smell, you could just scoop them up, pop them in your mouth, and they would be delicious. I usually judge things on whether I would eat them. So, I mean, you don't get this body not judging what to eat. And so you want nice, healthy larvae, a nice pattern, a couple skips, but nothing too concerning. They're backfilled with nectar there. If you don't see this, you need to figure out why you don't see this. It could be a pest and disease. It could also be a queen issue, which we'll talk about queen issues in a second. But if you're not seeing this, you need to figure out why. You can't just ignore it. It's not gonna fix itself, probably. If you see it like this, that does not look delicious. You wouldn't want to eat that. That looks like it smells bad. This is American foul brood. It's caused by a bacteria. What happens is the bacteria is eaten by the larvae, and when they're 0 to 3 days old, the spores get into their gut and they germinate and they start growing. And they start feeding off the larvae, eventually killing it. And when they kill it, they produce hundreds of millions of spores. This one's kind of interesting because it's a bacteria that produces spores. That's not super common. It's a really neat thing. But they produce hundreds of millions of spores, which then go out into the hive, infect more larvae, kills more larvae, produce more spores, and you get this kind of disgusting, collapsing hive. These spores are resistant to heat, desiccation, and cold, and they are viable for at least 80 years. We just stopped counting at 80 years. So if you buy equipment from the back of somebody's barn who kept bees in the 70s, you can put your bees on them and they can still die and get infected by spores that are in that equipment. So be really, really, really careful with used equipment, especially if it was used in the 70s, 80s, 90s, because in Maine, that was when foul brood, American foul brood, was at its worst in the state. The reason my position exists is because of this disease. So back in the late 70s, the beekeepers in the state of Maine went to the state government and said, we need help. Our hives are dying from American foul brood. We need somebody to help us with this. We need a position. And they formed the apiary program as a result. Most of the apiary programs around the country were formed because of this disease, because it was so bad. Now, in Maine, we have 1 or 2 cases a year. And usually it's in equipment that was bought out of the back of somebody's barn who kept bees a long time ago and doesn't have bees on it. 2 years ago, we did have 6 hives that I needed to destroy that had been put on old equipment. But most of the time, beekeepers contact me, they have me look at it, I find signs of this, and then I just dispose of the equipment for them. They can't use it. There's no way to fix it. So you get this peppered brood pattern. The cappings are sunken, greasy, perforated, darkened. If you take a toothpick and twirl it around in that larvae and pull it up, it ropes out. It's kind of like a snot that doesn't stop, like one of those that's like attached to the back of your brain. You know, you just keep pulling on it. And so this is really characteristic. It's also kind of a caramel coloration. What happens over time, and this is how I can tell in old equipment often, if I can't see old comb, I will actually send it off for testing. But what happens is the larvae dies, and then it slinks down to the bottom. It kind of sinks to the bottom, and it forms this dark scale on the bottom of the cell. And that stays there, and that's got tons and tons of spores in it. So if you put your bees in there, they get exposed to those spores, and then they die. And this smells. You can see that smells. That's going to smell gross. It smells like rotting meat, sulfur. To me, it smells like dirty sweat socks, like hockey gear. So I play hockey, so I can say my gear smells like this. It's like that kind of sweaty, gross smell. So you'll know it when you see it. If you think you have this, contact me.
Like when you open the hive, can you smell it or pull out a frame, or do you need to like put your face right?
If it's like this, oh yeah, this will hit you, like you will smell it before you even get to the hive. If it's like this, in an early infection, sometimes you don't. Sometimes if there's only a couple cells that are showing this, you don't smell it. I have a terrible sense of smell, like really bad sense of smell, and I can smell it. So it's maybe I'm just attuned to AFB. Lucky me. That and European foul brood, I can smell both from a mile away.
So in the case of AFB, if you had a colony that you had an issue with your woodware, you can remove that colony and the bacteria isn't transmitted. Or no, would it still be in the bees? Do the bees have to be destroyed, is I guess what I'm trying to stumble around?
Yeah,
Okay.
we do. We actually, if it's a living hive that's exhibiting it, we actually exterminate the hive, and then we actually dig a pit, burn all of the equipment, and then bury the ashes in like under the ground. It's that concerning. But with that said, there have been I've had several cases where, like for instance, 2 years ago when I had 6 hives that needed to be disposed of or killed, there were 2 other hives on the property that never showed any infection. We tested them and we came back, tested them, came back, tested them, and they never tested positive, and they were just maybe 100 feet away from the other one. So it's not every hive necessarily. If it goes long enough, it will become every hive because this will fail, and then your other hives will come in and rob this, and they'll pick up this infected honey. This is the other reason why you never ever want to use somebody else's honey to feed your bees. So don't go to the store, always feed them sugar syrup. Don't go to the store and buy a big, Sam's Club industrial vat of honey to feed your bees for the winter, because that can have spores in it. That's one of the ways that we transfer between hives. You take a honey frame that's been in an AFB hive and put it into your hive, they can get infected from those spores that are in the honey. And this is the other reason why if you catch a swarm that you don't know where it came from, always put those swarms on undrawn comb. So always put them on foundation, put them on foundation or undrawn comb, pre-comb foundation. And that's because if they have AFB, if they came from an AFB hive and they have honey that's infected in their guts, they'll actually process that when they get to that new foundation to make wax, and then it's no longer infective. So the way that they process it kills the spores. And they're not feeding it to their larvae because there's no larvae being made at that point. So that's the other reason, if you get a swarm, you don't know where it came from, put it on brand new equipment. See, look at this. All these guys are learning stuff today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So European foul brood is like the younger sister, like the little ugly stepsister of American foul brood. This is also a bacteria. This one doesn't produce spores, so it's not as long lived in a hive, but the cells can survive for several months. So if you have a hive that has EFB, transferred frames to another hive, you could give it to the other one. Same thing, the bacteria gets in the gut, kills the larvae. If it's young, if it's old, it'll actually just replicate in the gut, and then the bee will vomit. The larvae will start throwing up more bacteria, which then gets all over the system. And this is kind of what it looks like. You get these kind of curved larvae that are off-colored. They're almost a kind of a peachy color to yellow. And you can see their trachea, so their breathing tubes. Bees don't have lungs like we do. They have these little tubes that they breathe through. And they almost look like if you took a clementine, like a clementine slice, those little white things that go down, that's what they look like. And so you'll see that, and they're deflated. They do form a scale, but it's like brown and rubbery. It's not like hard and black like the AFB. And the other thing with this is that if you take a toothpick and curl it around in the larvae and pull it out, it may rope a little bit, but it's got more of a consistency of like a loogie, that thing that you pull from the back of your throat. You will never forget this. You'll be like, is this more of a loogie or is this like a nose?
Oh my God.
A nose pucker. And this smells, they do smell in an advanced case, and it smells a lot like, it's like sour, like dead fish. So it's kind of a fishy, rotting fish smell. This is more common, and it's more common because it's a stress-related disease. So this shows up in hives that usually are under some sort of stress. So if you see this in your hive is pretty much telling you there's something not right. And most of the time it's food. So we usually see it in the late spring. Our bees start building up, because they have a very short season, so they build up really fast. And then we get mud season, not the last 2 years, but normally we get mud season where it's cold and rainy for a full month. And the bees can't get out and forage, so they have all this larvae that's kind of starving. And so recognizing that in the spring, if you're getting a quick build up, you have some really nice weather, and then we're having a stretch of really bad weather, too cold for the bees to go out and forage, you're feeding during that time. The way that we usually deal with this is a beekeeper will call me, they're like, I have European foul brood. I'm like, okay, take a sample of it, send it off for testing, which is free, and I'll tell you all about that in a second. But start feeding it for the next 2 weeks while we wait back for the samples to come back. 9 out of 10 times they come back, it's EFB, and I talk to the beekeeper, and the hive is recovering. So this is mostly driven by food deficiencies. So if you're starting to see this in the hive, make sure you're giving them pollen substitute and also sugar syrup. They need that.
Would you be doing the 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or?
2 to 1,
2 to
whatever,
1,
yeah. So 2 parts sugar. I always feed 2 to 1. I never feed 1 to 1.
Okay.
I know how to make 2 to 1. I know 1 to 1's just as easy, but it's what I make default. So I always feed my bees 2 to 1. I don't see any reason to make them get more water out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one, we get about 5%, maybe 5% of beekeepers see this every year in one of their hives. And then chalk brood, this one is a little more popular up in the northern parts of the state. This is a fungus. The larvae get infected and they turn into these hard mummies that are white to gray. And this one is another one where if you see it, you can hear them. These are mummies. I need some new ones. These are like completely crushed now. I shake them so much. I'll tell you how I usually collect these. And this is another one where you'll see them before you even get into the hive, because they'll be out in front of the hive. The bees, when they're cleaning them out, they drop them out in front of the hive, so you can usually see them before you even open it up. And these it weakens the hives. The spores are viable for a long time. This is also a stress disease. It only happens if the larvae during a 3-day period in their growth are chilled and moist. So it's pretty much telling you that your hive is in a bad location. So usually if you move the hive to another location that's more sun exposure and maybe drier, it usually comes out of it no problem. I get my samples for this. So I have an orchard, small orchard on my property. It would be bee cooked to put my bees out there and have them going about the orchard. If I put a hive there, it pops with chalk brood every single time, because there's a little bit of divot, so it holds fog, stays a little bit wet, and it's shaded, so it stays a little bit cooler. And that's how I always get my samples of chalk broods. I just have to throw a hive out there and collect all the mummies. And then I move it back to where my normal yard is, right behind my house, where it can sting my husband all the time, and it'll come right out of it. So again, this is another one that your hive is telling you that it needs to be in a different location. So, and if it's persistent, if it doesn't clear up after that, there is some new evidence, some new research out there that talks about certain genetic lines of queens are more predisposed to this. So if it doesn't clear up with you moving it, then try a queen, replacing a queen with a queen from a different source than you got your first queen. So don't go back to the same source, because you need a different genetic line. And then nosema. So this is another one. We have 2 different types of nosema. One causes this big poopy mess. One does not. The one that's more common now in the state of Maine is the one that does not. So Nosema cerani here. This is another fungus. It's a microsporidian, which is, if you know anything about fungus, is the coolest group of fungi ever. They're like responsible for killing frogs and stuff like that. I mean, they're just amazing. They're mobile. Oh, so cool. Anyway, look them up. They're cool. Look up microsporidia. You'll love them. And so it does impair the digestion of the pollen. It usually, for most beekeepers with this new strain, cerani, about 95% of the cases come back as that. 5% are apis, where you get this poopy mess. But cerani doesn't seem to be as impactful on our bees. So before, you used to have to treat with fumagillin, and you have to do all these things to reduce the likelihood of getting nosema. It's not that big of a deal anymore. With this one, with cerani, you may get a test back and you have really high levels 1 month. You test those same bees the next month, the same hive, and it's cleared itself out. It kind of goes cyclical during the season. In the South, they have more problems with this one than we do. So we're really lucky that we have this really short, fast season, because we have such nice fly days, and we don't really have a break, too much of a dearth, that this fungus can kind of get a foothold. So if you have a hive that's not kind of thriving, you've ruled everything else out, we'll look at this as a possible cause, but it's usually not that big of a deal if the hive is otherwise healthy. And so we do have a place that we send off our samples to. They do nosema, mites, EFB, AFB testing, and it's all free for beekeepers. You can just send in a sample. Give them a little bit of information. So it's a USDA Beltsville lab. They're way backed up right now because they're about 2 years behind now because of the shutdown over COVID. They're not really 2 years behind, but it's taking forever to get the samples back to us. I've been waiting for 3 weeks on a sample, and that's much longer than normal. So don't use this as your only screening if you're going to send in for varroa mite sampling, because it will take you a while and your hive will probably be dead by the time you get the samples back. But that's where we send off our samples. If we need a rush job, if it's AFB, we actually have another lab that we use that we pay for. So, but this is free for beekeepers. So pests and diseases, queen issues, that's the other thing to look for. You need to requeen if needed. If it's a queen issue, requeen. I know we all feel very, like our hearts are part of our queens are like part of our family. We never want to get rid of them. You baby them, you like, you know, just one more, maybe you'll work it out. They don't work it out. If they're failing, they need to be replaced. It's a cruel, hard world in the beehive, and if you have a queen that's failing, she needs to be replaced. So signs of queen issue is there's no eggs or brood. Doesn't necessarily mean you don't have a queen, especially if you just swarmed. If you swarmed and you caught the swarm, put her in a new hive, and you have this one that's requeening itself, and you come back a week later, you don't see eggs and larvae, don't freak out. Wait another week, check back again, and then still don't freak out. Wait another week and check back. 3 weeks. It could take up to 3 weeks for a new queen to get in there and start laying. And if she's a little bit spotty at the beginning, that's okay. She's working it out, she's figuring it out, she doesn't know what she's doing to start off with. Give her a little bit of time. But if after 3 weeks, get a new queen in there. Lots of drone cells, drones, many emergency queen cups or cells, a spotty pattern. Late in the season, it's common to see a spotty pattern as they're collecting a lot of food and storing it for the winter. So because they start backfilling with nectar. So if you see, this is a nice pattern here, this is a nice beautiful queen here, nice pattern. But requeen her if you're starting to see issues. So this is a nice pattern, you can see the nice larvae here, there's your queen. Again, really nice larval pattern, she's just laying every single one of these. This is not a great pattern. So lots of drone cells, that you probably have a drone layer or a laying worker that got in here. So that needs to be fixed. Again, a really spotty pattern, you can see the cells are kind of being chewed down. You get a little bald brood, that's probably a problem. Again, spotty pattern, this is just, ugh. Lots of emergency queen cells with nothing going on, but you see no other really real brood in there. I got lots of pictures of bad queen brood, if you can't tell. I take a lot of pictures of these.
Is there a way of telling if the larvae is a drone or a worker when it's really young?
No, well, so there are sometimes you get a new queen, and this is one of the things that people will say. If you see multiple eggs in a cell, that's usually a drone laying worker. That's not always true. There's always exceptions to it. New queens will sometimes lay multiple eggs as well. So a new queen that's working it out, she doesn't have really great control when she first starts out, and so she may spit out extra eggs. Sometimes the laying workers, they can't reach their abdomens all the way down into the bottom of the cell, so if the eggs are on the side, that's also a good indication, not necessarily true, but it's a good indication that you may have a laying worker in there. So, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, I can't tell. I won't be able to tell if it's a worker.
No. If you see a queen in there, then
They always hide.
it's a bad queen. But if it's a laying workers are a little bit harder to fix too. They will sometimes a hive that has a laying worker will sometimes kill an introduced queen over and over, which is really heartbreaking because you spend $40 on them and then they kill it on you. Again, this one, spotty pattern, but you can see that the larvae's not in the right position. It's kind of slumped. This was EFB. And this one's another laying worker or a drone layer. Ugh. I look at so many bad pictures of things. So this here looks like a spotty pattern, that this would be bad. But if you look at each of these cells, they're kind of glistening. This is actually later in the season, and they're starting to backfill with nectar. So what happens normally is a hive, the population increases, and then they level off, and then they start going down in preparation for winter, and they start condensing and pushing the bees down to the bottom box, so they start backfilling from the top. So as these bees were emerging, they were backfilling with nectar, getting ready for winter. So this is okay. It's not bad. That happens. So, yep. Okay, and then food. If your hive needs food, feed it. Done. All right. No, food is really important, and it's really hard to tell sometimes whether hives are getting enough. So if you go into the hive and it's just kind of like meh, maybe they're a little bit bratty, more bratty than normal. That could also be a sign that they're food stressed. If you start seeing robbing between your hives or a lot of investigation from bees over here going over there, that can also be a sign of food stress. If you go in and there's no food, they don't have enough food, so you should start feeding. This year, I have a strong suspicion that we're going to be dry. I think we already are. And so really pay attention to what's going on out there. You may see, last year we saw beautiful bloom of goldenrod, but if you went out into the field and looked at those, you never saw a bee on them. So flowers will still bloom, and they'll still produce some pollen and maybe a little bit of nectar, but if there's no water, no moisture in the soil, they don't produce a lot of nectar. And so if you walk out and you look through a field and you don't see a single bee out there, that's a good indication that they're not producing nectar. So it was beautiful blooms last year, but nothing was producing any nectar. So you want to see stored honey. You want to see honey kind of up at the top, or nectar, some pollen. This is the nice rainbow. Everybody always talks about the rainbow. Might never do this. I wish they did. And then you get your brood. And as the season goes on, they'll actually condense this down and then push down into the bottom box. Same thing here, a little bit of a spotty pattern, but we have, some honey on the outskirts here. And so it's really important to look for signs. So if you're not seeing any honey in there or any nectar, that's a sign that you may have a problem. Another one is looking at your larvae. So your larvae should be floating in just gorgeous, milky liquid, like they're just in a little swimming pool themselves. This is a well-fed hive. This one here, you can see these larvae are dry. So I like to call these, dry sockets. And you can see there's different ages of larvae going on. So we have eggs here right next to kind of more developed and then even older larvae. And that's because if they don't have enough food to feed their larvae, they'll actually start aborting them. So they'll go in, the bees, they're like, sorry, I can't feed you, and they'll pull them out and dump them in front of the hive and kill them. And so you get this kind of mixed generation of really dry larvae. And the queen is trying to she's doing a good job, she's trying to do her job, but there's just no food to feed them. So it's really important, if you're seeing some of these signs, that you are feeding your hive. Sorry, there was another one here. So look for signs of food stress. And then also there's this weird thing that bees do. They're hoarders, but they don't realize what they have sometimes. So they will sometimes have a full honey super on top of them and then kind of starve to death because it's capped. And capped means for later. That's not for now. And so often if you start seeing the signs of food stress, but you have food in there, if you take a fork and scrape up those cappings, they'll come in contact and they're like, oh, look, there's food. So sometimes doing something like that can also get them going. So start feeding fixed syrup and keep an eye out for robbing. Those are all really important things. And again, look to see what's going on outside in the world. So if we haven't had rain, there's a good chance that nothing's producing nectar. And so taking if you're just driving down the road and you see a nice wildflower field, walk out and just see, are there bees out there? Because they'll tell you whether there's anything worth eating. So we build up. So you check for your pests and diseases, you requeen if you need to. If you have a weakish hive that's kind of reduced population, you figured out what was going on, but it's kind of at that stage where you're like, is this going to be able to make it? Like, it seems really low in population. You can always boost it with a couple frames from another hive, as long as that hive is also healthy. So take some capped brood. Capped brood is all fed. So your hive that you're introducing that to doesn't need to feed that brood. It does not need to waste any resources to grow that up. It's already ready to go. So you take that capped brood, plop it into the other hive. Those nurse bees will come up. If you had a problem with chalk brood or European foul brood or something like that, they'll actually they'll help clean up. Nurse bees are our cleanup bees. And so they'll clean up that infection for you. So boosting that population with capped brood can be really important. And don't worry about transferring bees from one hive to the next. So bees love food and they love babies. So if you can give them babies from any other hive, they are happy as can be. So you can always give babies, and they'll always accept bees that have food. And then if it's past its past its problem, or past its prime, you know, it was a queen issue, it didn't have a disease, and you're like, this is just isn't gonna make it, combine it. So we see this a lot with, you know, a failed package, where maybe the queen wasn't great, you have 2 packages, you bought these 2 beautiful packages, one, the queen sucked and didn't make it, and population just dwindles before you caught it, and you have one that's nice and strong, combine them together, and then you can always split them later on, and then you get back to your 2. But combine them, don't just let it kind of fizzle out and peter out, you can combine those if it is a queen issue. If it's a disease, don't combine it with a healthy hive, because then you just have a bigger diseased hive, so. And then another thing, one last thing that you can do is reduce the space. So if you have your hive built up, and you had put on your second box, queen got smushed, they didn't requeen themselves, you ended up with a queen issue, so you introduced a new queen, but now they really haven't started using that second box, reduce them back down. It's okay to remove boxes if there's too much space. There's something weird with bees also. Bees are weird, if you can tell. Everything that I keep saying, bees are weird. One of the other things is that bees don't, if they have too much space, it's too much work for them, and so giving them less to work with can sometimes also help them regulate temperature, regulate where the food goes, and really condense and work more efficiently. If they have a lot of room, they need to patrol it, and they might put food up here, which then they can't access if it's a little bit chilly to get up there, so reduce down their space. Oh, and then one last plug. In Maine, we have mandatory registration for your apiaries, so please register your bees. There's a lot of reasons why you should do it. I brought forms, so if you have never registered your bees before, or you're a new beekeeper this year, it's really painless. You just fill out the form, send it into our office, and then you'll get this nice little card in the mail. It costs $10 for 1 to 10 hives, so relatively inexpensive. And we do it for a bunch of different reasons, mostly American foul brood. If I find American foul brood, and it's in your, you know, neighbor's yard, or down the street, or within 5 miles of your house, I will contact you and let you know that I found it. I'm not gonna tell you who it was, you can ask all you want, I'm not gonna tell you, but I will tell you that you are within the fly zone, and to be extra vigilant. Would you like an inspection at this point? You know, I can come by and take a look, make sure your hives look okay. And it's really valuable. It's really valuable for us to know where the other hives are in an area when we have to mitigate American foul brood, because it does spread between hives, and it can, we don't wanna be like some of the other states in the country where they have serious AFB issues. The other thing is that if there are non-agricultural related applications of pesticides that are aerial in nature, they actually contact me, and I give them a list of beekeepers that are maybe going to be in the affected area. We don't have this happen all that often. Actually, since I've been here, I've not had it happen at all. But with mosquitoes becoming more of an issue, things like EEE and West Nile virus, this may be something that some municipalities may be doing in the future. So it's something you will get notified, hopefully get notified by the people who are, by the municipalities who are doing that. And then finally, for your $10 fee, you get an inspection a year if you want it. You just reach out to me and put in a little request for it, and I'll come down and take a look at your hives. And it could be if you have a problem, we'll fix it. If you don't and you just want to check up, especially if you're new and you have no idea what you're doing, those are my favorite ones. Those are all valid reasons to get an inspection, and it doesn't cost anything as long as you're registered with the state. So, awesome. That's it. Are there any questions?
So,
Yeah.
when you said the bees love babies, does that include a cat queen cell? When you put a cat queen cell into a
Those,
different colony that doesn't have a queen?
yeah, kind of. So queen cells, introducing queen cells, can be challenging. But if a hive is really eager for a queen, usually they will accept a queen cell. So usually when people are making splits, either you're buying a queen from a breeder, somebody who makes them, and you introduce that when you do your split, or you're moving queen cells, and they will accept those. And when you're making splits, you can use like queen cells from a different hive into there, and it'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I do a queen cell split, and let's just say hypothetically, I thought this was a queenless colony, but there's a queen and I didn't see her. Will she kill that queen as she tries to emerge? Or have I just created a potential swarm?
So they can swarm sometimes. So if it's an older queen and it may cause the hive, so if the hive gets super excited about the new queen coming out, they may send her out the door. So I have seen it where people put a second queen in there and it could swarm. Also what can happen is that that queen that's in there established will kill it. So it could happen both ways.
Which would be the
So-
preferred way.
Which would be the preferred way,
Right,
yes.
right.
But it doesn't always happen. So I've had hives, I've had beekeepers who have introduced, like, made a split, put a new queen in there, doing fine, and then moved a frame, and there was a queen cell on there that they didn't catch, and then that hive was swarming right away. So,
I'm 3 steps behind at the moment with a couple of mine, I can't.
yeah.
And I'm always, when I go in there, I can't find the queen, so I find a queen cell. And in theory, there's already been a swarm because of that, but I'm not sure that always holds true. I've had some super strong colonies that have still had queen cells in them. But my point being, I didn't see the queen, so I leave the queen cell hoping she's gonna be the
And
new
just-
virgin
yeah.
queen, and then 3 days later, I see a mass of bees up in the trees.
Just talk to them. Just tell them, say,
Right,
hey,
right.
you
Keep
know,
stuff together.
I'm putting this in here as a backup. If you don't need it, just kill it for
Feel
me.
free to kill
yeah,
it.
just kill it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had it happen both ways.
Yeah,
So
okay.
yeah.
Is it a bad idea to get bees from my blueberry field after they leave, after the
The boxes of leaves.
boxes leave and you can collect what's left of the bees? Is that a bad idea?
So, not necessarily. So one of my other jobs as this position is I actually inspect the migratory beekeepers that come in. So I look at every operation. I don't meet with them, but I usually check in with each of the beekeepers. And in general, most of the blueberry pollinators are really careful about brood diseases. So American foul brood. They do tend to run a little bit hot with European foul brood, but because their hives are a little bit more stressed, is really. And blueberries don't make the most nutritious food, so their pollen is not the most round nutrition good for bees. And so they're a little bit food stressed, and then they move around a lot, just like us when we go on a flight, you know, where you're gonna get sick when you get home from vacation. It always happens. It's the same sort of thing for bees when you move them around. So they do have a little more tendency to having European foul brood. But often what happens, so when you collect those bees that are left behind, the left behind bees, those usually don't have a queen with them. They're usually just a bunch of left behind field bees,
Angry.
and they are angry as hell. They are like the most angry things in the world. One of the things that you can do as a beekeeper is actually collect them, which is very helpful to your community. I appreciate when beekeepers collect them because then I don't get a call from a neighbor that's like, my face is getting stung up every time I leave the house. So you can collect them, and the way you usually do is you put out a box and they will go to it where those hives were. So you put the box down, they go in, and then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're putting them on foundation, either introducing a queen, which can sometimes be a little bit hard with them, or you can combine them with another hive, but you want to make sure that you don't see, like, that there's no mites on them and that sort of thing. That's going to be your biggest thing, is most of the beekeepers that collect them use them to boost another hive. So they'll combine them, they'll put them on top of a weaker hive with newspaper and let them kind of join a weak hive. And then you just want to be really careful that you're making sure that that's not showing any disease after that, and that your mites are under control. And the mites are easy enough. When you collect that, you just take your scoop right out and do your mite wash and make sure that they don't need a treatment right at that point.
And then if they did, before you combined anything, you just hit them, you can vaporize them.
You
with
can
this
oxalic acid because you have no brood.
Right.
It's perfect. All your bees, all your mites are going to be in their dispersal phase. They're going to be on the adult bees, and that's a perfect treatment for that.
So, okay, kind of a question dovetails with the agricultural bees.
Yeah.
Is, I've heard that some of them have some Africanized genes potentially in them, because it only makes sense. That I've also read that the Africanized bees are actually becoming less bad because the native, or not native, but, you know, honeybee DNA is, so that goes to my question. I go get a swarm off a blueberry field. should I be concerned about that genetic material?
You
I
will-
don't wanna make mine more aggressive, I'd
Yes.
like to make that aggressive one less
Yes,
aggressive.
you will, so you can absolutely, if it's an aggressive hive, if it's mean, pinch the queen and put in a new queen with
Okay.
genetic stock that you want, absolutely, just pinch her and put in a new queen, and you'll see within 1 or 2 brood cycles that they will calm down because they will follow the genetics of that new queen.
Okay.
So that's the best way to deal with it. There's most of the migratory beekeepers don't put up with Africanized genetics
Okay.
because they're a bear to work with, and you need people to help you. And if they're getting their faces stung off, they will not help you. So a lot of them are requeening if they're coming from Florida or Texas or Louisiana or something like that, they are requeening every year, at least every year. It could be even more
Okay, so
frequently.
they're not
So they're not letting it really get into the system. But that's not to say that when they requeen, they're often using cells. Those cells can mate with drones that are Africanized, and that's where the
Right.
genetics gets in there. But so yeah, if you are seeing a hive that is aggressive, absolutely you don't need to deal with that. You don't need to put up with it. Pinch that queen and get a new queen, new mated queen from somebody local. And that would be the best way to do that, and it should settle down. We do occasionally have aggressive hives in the state that do cause trouble. We had one down kind of southern mid-coast a couple of years ago that actually got all ramped up, killed a bunch of chickens, was like stinging kids, and the police department had to come in and set it on fire and kill it because it was killing chickens. Like it was out of control. And so they can get ramped up and they can have issues. But one thing also, it could be genetic, but it also could be situational. So if hives can get really riled up. If anybody's had a bear attack on a hive, there's nothing meaner than a hive you put back together after a bear attack.
Mhm.
They are mean and angry. But the other thing is skunks and raccoons. So what they do at night, a skunk will go up the hive in the night and will sit there and knock on the front, and the bees will come out to investigate, and the skunk will scoop up the bees, put them in their mouth, chew them up, and suck out the juices, and then they spit out the carcasses. And they'll do that for hours and hours and hours. So then what happens is you leave your house the next morning and the hive's all ramped up and they will start stinging you. So if you have a hive that you could work, go out there in your bikini and no smoker and all that stuff, and then overnight it's meaner than it won't let you leave the house. Look for signs like that. Vertebrates can really rile up a hive very quickly. So either bears messing with it, or you'll probably know if it's a bear. But skunks are a really big one too. Yeah.
Does the oxalic acid kill the mites, or is it the grooming of the bees afterwards that
It
kills
kills
the
the
bees?
mites. We don't know how, but it does. It's magic.
It's magic?
We haven't quite figured out exactly what mode of action it has, what it's doing. There's a lot of different theories out there that it's, burning their feet, or it's toxic to them in some other way. We don't really know how it works. We just know that it works.
What again?
Oxalic acid.
Oh.
Yeah. So the vaporizer specifically. We just know it works. So that gives you some sort of.
I was gonna ask you if they'd ever figured that out, and there's my
No,
answer.
it makes you feel a little bit weird about it, right?
And then it
You
makes
don't
you
know
wonder,
why
how
it
did
works.
somebody even figure to go that route and
Yeah.
check to see if it did work?
Yeah. So there are going to be. So the other thing that's going on right now is that there is actually a bunch of testing going on through that organization, the Honeybee Health Coalition. They are testing right now some new mite pesticides. So we have these products that were tested for some sort of pesticide, and we call them orphan chemistries, where they were tested and they didn't really work out for what they were testing them on, so they kind of were forgotten. And the Honeybee Health Coalition has picked up a bunch that were used for mites, were tested for mites in general, and started testing them in hives and against varroa mites. And so they started off with 20 some odd chemistries, and I think they're down to 4 now that show promise. So we might be getting some new stuff on the market. Actually, coming to speak is somebody who is doing a lot of that work for that Maine State Beekeepers Association in August. Is MedHat coming in August?
I don't know.
I think, so MedHat Nasser, who is a researcher, well, he was an apiary inspector up in Canada, is retired now, and he's been doing a lot of that research. So he's going to be coming to speak at one of the webinars that the Maine State Beekeepers Association is going to be giving this summer. So you guys can ask him that question too. Awesome. Oh my gosh, how long did I talk for? Oh, 7 o'clock.
Well, thank you, Jen.
Awesome. Well, grab stuff. And if you prefer, so we have some of these jars, but if you prefer actually using a wide mouth canning jar, I have wide mouth screens that are attached in here. So it's in this little paper bag. It says wide. So you just need to get your own wide mouth jar, and then you can use this if you want one of those as a backup. Some people like the wide mouth better. So awesome. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.